Right, our next speaker is Sarah and Tom representing Poole and District Fishermen's Association and Sarah representing Southern IFCA, talking about a real example of developing co-management. Hello, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here to speak today. My name's Sarah and I work for the Southern IFCA, and I'm pleased to be joined at the end of my talk by Tom Russell, who's the chairman of the Poole and District Fishermen's Association and is also one of the permit holders in the fishery, which I'm going to speak to you about today. So there's a bit of background context to start with. So as we all know, the management of inshore fisheries has changed. And this is reflecting the changing needs of the marine environment. We very much moved from the old traditional preoccupation with fishing being a way of securing a sustainable food resource, and that leading into very much single species focused management, to a fisheries management approach which considers the needs of and aims to offer that wider protection to the ecosystem as a whole. As we've seen this map in a number of iterations today, but this emerging MPA network, and particularly the revised approach, has very much focused the change in attitude towards fisheries management. We're very much more aware of the need to protect our habitats and species, and yet this has resulted in tensions emerging between competing interests, between that protection of the marine environment and the need for a sustainable industry. And this has probably been felt most acutely in our inshore waters, where we have a number of MPAs which need to be addressed in terms of fisheries management, but are also home to some long-standing fishing activity which has an integral role in the social and economic stability of our coastal populations. So alongside the evolution in our approach to fisheries management, there's been an evolution in the policy which allows us to do this. And this is very much recognising that need to reconcile the tensions which emerge and deliver sustainable development across the board. The primary vehicle for this, of course, was the Marine and Coastal Access Act, and for fisheries management, the creation of IFCAs, which really gave an improved and more robust legal framework for decision making, for regulation, and also for the enforcement of those regulations. The IFCA duties are very much about balance, balance between the marine environment and the sustainability of the fishing industry. But an interesting addition as well was considering the needs of the persons engaged in that industry, and that very much leads us towards more of a culture of communication and engagement than I think was seen previously. So something that's bandied about a lot when it comes to fisheries management is the difference between top-down and bottom-up regulation and the way in which these can and should be combined. So our top-down regulation is really, the sort of the black and white bits, the conservation legislation, so the Habitats Directive, the Birds Directive, the things that set in stone what needs to be done for these sites, the conservation objectives that need to be met. And then we have our bottom-up approach, which is the local and diverse knowledge that our stakeholders, our fishers, hold, and the way in which that can better inform us about the socio-economic and cultural context of an MPA. And it's emerged that IFCAs are really in a position to be able to achieve a combination of top-down and bottom-up regulation through a co-management system, by which we have the potential to not only address both of these facets, but also address the perception of conservation management, particularly by the fishing industry, which is often creates a barrier to what we do. The bottom-up input ultimately necessary to achieving long-term compliance with the top-down regulation. So this co-management approach to delivering economic and ecosystem benefits is well explored in the Poole Harbour clam and cockle fishery. So just as a bit of background, Poole Harbour is a key fishing port on the south coast of the UK in Dorset. Fishing has been taking place there for many hundreds of years, from oysters through to crab and lobster. And then in the early 90s, through the introduction of the Manila clam, initially for aquaculture and then commercial harvesting, a vibrant and well-founded dredge fishery has developed in this harbour, whereby pump scoop dredging equipment is used for clam and cockle species. However, all this sits within a site which is an SPA, a Ramsar site and a SSSI, so we've got several layers of protection here within which this fishery needs to sit. Historic management of the clam and cockle fishery was this single species focused kind of management. We had one management scheme for clams, we had a different management scheme for cockles, and yet both of these species are fished using the same gear type. The main objective of this was to maintain and protect a sustainable harvest prior to the need for that to be mirrored in the conservation management. And this resulted in an overly complex management scheme, as I said, different regulations for different species, and all this was wrapped up into the expiration of the fisheries management method that we had, which was the Poole Fishery Order 1985. And in that, the Southern IFCA realised that there was an opportunity here to completely revisit the way in which this fishery was managed, explore a new approach which was consistent with those changes in attitudes towards fisheries management within an MPA. But this was a challenge, and this was a challenge that the Southern IFCA recognised, and in starting out in this process, it was key to define the problems which needed to be addressed. And there were a number of problems to be considered. Firstly, maintaining a dredge fishery, a kind of bottom-towed fishing gear, within an MPA. The conservation objectives for the SPA in particular, which defines Poole as a European marine site, set some very definite boundaries for this fishery. And if we didn't adhere to those, the fishery simply wouldn't be able to exist. The ability to manage multiple species which use the same gear type and trying to bring that into a single regulation as opposed to various pieces of legislation which didn't all quite fit together. Possibly one of our biggest challenges was the ability to address the historic levels of non-compliance in the fishery. Manila clam is a very valuable shellfish species, and as a result, a fairly well-established poaching network had developed for Poole, and that was basically where the fishery sat in everybody's mind. Nobody wanted clams from Poole because they must be illegally fished. This wasn't helped by existing loopholes in legislation, and this ultimately undermined the legitimate value of the fishery, posing a risk to public health and also resulting in a distrust between the fishing industry and the fisheries managers. And it was also recognised that there had previously been a lack of opportunity for communication and engagement, which hadn't helped with that relationship between the two parties. So there was a risk going forward that if these were not addressed, the fishery would always continue to be undervalued. And so there was a need to balance the sustainability of the fishery with the objectives of the MPA, whilst allowing stakeholders to really get involved. So we came to the Poole Harbour Dredge Permit Bylaw, which is the regulation we have in place at the moment. A flexible restricted entry permit system which permits the gear rather than the species, and also comes with a set of conditions which really helps to address the environmental aspects of the fishery. The flexible permit scheme also allows us to be reactive and therefore to adapt the management as needed in the face of changes to the environment, changes to the fishery, and any other changes which emerge which may affect the way in which this operates. Through these conditions and the strict regulation applied, we're able to address that top-down regulation and allow that fishery to operate within the boundaries of the MPA. In addition, we implemented over a 2-year period a communication and engagement programme where stakeholders were invited to participate through a variety of mechanisms, one-to-one meetings, drop-in sessions, workshops, over all relevant sectors, and this continued all the way through from initial ideas to the implementation of the bylaw, which really helped change the way in which the IFCA interacted with these fishers. So what were the benefits delivered by this approach? We were able to improve protection for the marine environment, permanent closed areas, seasonal closed areas, temporal restrictions, gear restrictions, all of this allows us to protect the features for which the site is designated. We also have continued systems of monitoring and feedback which allow us to monitor this and ensure that the bylaw is achieving its objectives. Wider societal benefits as well, the ability to maintain provisioning services offered by things like salt marsh, reed bed, in terms of carbon sequestration by other bivalve species, and allows us to look forward and potentially explore the filtration potential of the species we have in the harbour to improve water quality. And finally, the reduction in illegal, unregistered and unlicensed fishing, the simplification of management, the removal of regulatory loopholes and the restricted entry meant that in the space of a year, illegal activity went down by 95%, and we went from 34% of all our inspections being of illegal vessels to 1% in the space of a year. So the promotion of the fishery beyond its local boundaries was explored through the MSc and RFS project, a global first simultaneous certification under both schemes, which not only promoted the awareness of the fishery and allowed it to be market-facing, it revised historic perceptions on a national scale, encouraged future investment, and allowed the fishers to really take ownership of their fishery and celebrate the success that they had gained through this process, and also improving the market value in general. These are our fishers enjoying their certification as of 2018, and now I'd just like to invite Tommy to speak to you a bit from his perspective as a fisher in the industry.
I'm not used to this sort of thing. I do my best. Yeah, I've got a small boat. It's a little dory. It's only just over 5 metres, which is the general size of the boats in this fishery. Multi-layered conservation in Poole Harbour. It was terrible for poaching, which made bona fide fishermen a bit scared, didn't respect the fisheries with the IFCA. But as soon as we got the permit scheme, all that stopped, virtually overnight. I can see it with my own eyes. There's lots of people that sort of night flyers. They got a permit and it changed them. And I've had quite a few of them speak to me saying, oh, it's the best thing that happened. We can fish for 7 months. We can pick clams by hand through the winter, just with hands, and we can keep a living all year. Most of this money's earned locally. Most of it's spent locally. And that's about it, really. It's just a brilliant fishery, how it's turned out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for talking about what, looking in from the outside, was a really complicated place, really difficult place, both for the IFCA and for yourselves working there. And the amount of effort that you've all put in to turning that around is amazing. But to actually hear you speak, to say how quickly that's changed, that's so powerful.
It was straight away.
Yeah, it's absolutely wonderful
to
hear.
It's a very, very good fishery. And every year, it seems as though there's more clam on the ground.
So what else would you want but to get a fishery that can still work within an MPA, that delivers a living for the men working there, and is a better relationship for everybody? I'm sure you've got some questions for both Tommy and Sarah. Does anyone have any questions for them about the site or about the fishery? Mike?
Thanks, Sarah. That's really interesting, and Tommy as well. But there's a conundrum in Poole Harbour. You're fishing an alien species, and when the fishermen take that and they wash the catches they are doing there, the small manila clams are going through to the bed. So technically they are introducing an alien species into the bed. And that classically goes against part of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is their Descriptor 10, which is all about alien species. So in this area, to get around that, have you decided that manila clam is now a naturalized species, or are you sanctioning the introduction of an alien species by commercial fishermen?
So DEFRA has actually designated the manila clam as a naturalised species, so it's no longer classed as a invasive.
Okay. Very interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and had it not been such, we wouldn't have been able to achieve the MSC certification.
Yeah. Okay.
Rob, I believe you might have a question.
Thank you very much, Sam. It was related to that and hopefully a question also. But it does speak to the point about change.
And speak to your microphone a bit more. You're very quiet.
So, of course, in the 1980s, when it was proposed that the manila clam be introduced, it was a non-native alien species, and there was an idea that it might take over and ruin the ecology and variously destroy things. There's a brilliant paper by Humphreys et al. on this. But as we, yeah. But of course the seas are changing, and what we have in our MPAs are changing, and it's how, and fishermen have always adapted. It's how our bylaws adapt, and I've wondered if Sarah had any views on how our bylaws, and Tommy had a view on how the fishery will develop into the future.
So either of you can answer that. How do you think the fishery could develop in the future?
You don't expect a question from your own chief.
You'd think he'd ask you first, wouldn't you?
I think one of the key things about the management of the pool fishery is its flexibility. The permit scheme approach to fisheries management is a relatively new one, and one which has only been facilitated through the change in policy, as it said, under the Marine and Coastal Access Act. But that flexibility does allow us to be reactive going forward on a number of different bases, whether that's environmentally driven, species driven, changes in fishing habitats. So that's definitely, the vehicle is there for us to react to those changing circumstances. I think Rob's right. I think we just need to be aware of how our seas are changing. You know, we face a similar situation at the moment with the Pacific oyster, which still is classed as an invasive species, yet is proliferating rapidly all the way around the coast. And again, you know, we may find ourselves in a situation where, like the manila clam, that too becomes naturalised, and management measures for that need to be explored. So I think, you know, there are changes, and our ability to react to those changes is much improved under the policy framework that we have now.
Thank you. A very quick question, last one, please. Dale, I believe, back there.
Thank you. It was a really good example to see IFCA's working closely with industry. I don't want this to sound negative. That's a good way to start. But you build it as a co-management approach, and I suppose the question is how is it co-managed in terms of delegated management to industry, or is it co-designed? You know, there's a participation ladder that a lot of us are looking at the moment. That's been circling around loads of interest in these matters. And I suppose that raises a question: if it's not delegated management, is that partly because we maybe don't have all the instruments we need to make real delegated management work? You know, for instance, from my own point of view, there only seems to be regulating orders and several orders that perhaps would give full delegated responsibility. And if so, is that something that needs to be looked at?
So I think it certainly was, as far as possible, co-designed. Obviously, as I said, there were some very definite boundaries set by the MPA which the fishery had to operate in. But we sort of went to the fishers on day one and said, look, this management needs to change. What do you want to see from your fishery? Before we had any proposals about bylaws. And we kept that back and forth going all the way through to the point where when the bylaw was introduced, we actually had no substantive objections to it at all. In terms of sort of a co-management approach going forward from that point, we've very much tried to keep that feedback loop between ourselves and the fishers. The fishers have the opportunity to trigger a review of permit conditions. We have a meeting once a year prior to the season opening where they are able to provide comment and feedback. And
Yeah, we've just done that.
and most of the fishers turn out for those
We do.
meetings.
Yeah, there's always consultations. There's a group of us would like to have altered the season, put it back a little bit, maybe go into the winter a bit longer, which might have upset some of the bird people. But our reason was to, we think we don't want to fish the clams when there's a danger of them breeding. But there was a bigger number of fishers who was quite happy as it was. So the IFCA this year have gone with that. It will be up for review.
So they have the ability to come to us, we can then investigate it. If it's something that we can't do, it's something that we can't do, but we definitely have that open dialogue all the way through every season.
Thank you. Can I just ask Tommy one question from me?
Yeah.
If there were fishermen in the room who said to you, would you suggest doing this with your IFCA, what would you say to them?
Say that again.
If there were fishermen who said, our IFCA's trying to get something like this started in our district, what would you say to them?
Well, I'd say ask Rob and Sarah.
But it sounds like it's been a good, positive experience. Yeah.
You've got to communicate. And what I said to Rob and I've said to most of the fishery officers, when us fishermen are talking about the fisheries, we speak to our fishery officers by their first name.
Yeah, and that says a lot,
There's
doesn't
no
it?
nicknames.
Yeah.
Just there's one that's got
Oh,
nicknames.
there's a few. So thank you very much. It's great to see you here, and thank you both for your presentation. Thank you.